After years of observing people, reflecting on their choices, and studying the patterns of human behavior, I've come to realize something powerful. Wisdom isn't about knowing everything, it's about how you live, how you treat others, and how you grow from your mistakes. Intelligence is often confused with knowledge, but the truth is, real wisdom reveals itself in the way someone carries themselves, how they react under pressure, and whether they're willing to face their own flaws. And here's the deeper insight. There are specific warning signs that reveal when someone is drifting away from wisdom and falling into foolishness. That's why in today's video we're going to uncover the 8 signs of a stupid person, not to shame or judge, but to awaken, reflect, and grow. Because recognizing these signs isn't about labeling others. It's about becoming more aware of our own habits, avoiding these pitfalls, and helping others rise when they fall. Each of these 8 signs carries a powerful lesson drawn from Stoic philosophy, lessons that challenge us to think deeper and live better. So if you're ready to take an honest look at the traits that hold people back and discover how to replace them with strength, wisdom, and purpose, let's begin. Sign number 1, a closed mind. A closed mind is like a locked door in a house full of windows. You may think you're keeping the storm out, but you're also blocking out the sunlight. It's one of the most telling signs of a foolish person. The refusal to consider new perspectives, ideas, or methods simply because they're unfamiliar or uncomfortable. This kind of rigidity doesn't always come from malice. More often, it's rooted in fear, pride, or a deep sense of insecurity. The foolish mind convinces itself that it already knows everything worth knowing, that the way it's always done things is the only way that works. But the wise understand a deeper truth. No matter how far we've come, we are all students of life. And learning never stops. A closed-minded person builds walls instead of bridges. They listen only to confirm what they already believe and reject anything that might challenge their worldview. They label new ideas as wrong without examination, often out of habit. The Stoics would call this a form of inner blindness, a refusal to see the changing nature of life and the constant opportunities for transformation. Marcus Aurelius, one of the greatest Stoic emperors, wrote, "If someone can prove me wrong and show me my mistake in any thought or action, I shall gladly change, for I seek the truth by which no one was ever truly harmed." That's the mindset of a wise person. Compare that to someone who says this is how it's always been done, even when everything around them is falling apart. That's not strength. It's stagnation in disguise. Let me give you a real example. Years ago, I worked with a department manager named Mark. He was respected for his experience, but feared for his unwillingness to adapt. His team was struggling to keep up with changing technology and more efficient workflows. But whenever someone suggested a new tool or modern approach, he shut it down. "We've been doing this for 10 years and it's worked fine," he would say with finality, refusing even to entertain the idea that something better might exist. It wasn't that the old way was entirely wrong, but the refusal to even look at alternatives was what doomed his leadership. While other teams in the company started to thrive with new systems, Mark's department lagged behind. Deadlines were missed, morale dropped, and instead of reflecting on his decisions, he blamed the team for poor execution. This is what happens when pride disguises itself as leadership. A closed mind doesn't just stop growing, it pulls everyone else backward with it. And when things inevitably begin to fall apart, that same closed mind rarely looks inward. It points fingers, it deflects. It retreats deeper into its bubble of self-righteousness, never realizing that the real problem was the refusal to adapt. Foolish people often mistake stubbornness for strength, but the Stoics knew that the strongest people are not those who never change, but those who are willing to learn, evolve, and rise above their former selves. Epictetus once said, "It is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows." That's the tragedy of a closed mind. It shuts out the very knowledge that could have liberated it. But here's the beautiful part. A closed mind can be opened. It takes courage, humility, and a willingness to be wrong. And that's not a weakness, it's one of the greatest forms of power. If you find yourself resisting feedback, avoiding new perspectives, or dismissing others because they challenge your beliefs, ask yourself, am I doing this to protect what's right, or to protect my ego? Am I defending the truth, or just defending myself? Growth begins with honesty. And sometimes the most honest thing we can do is admit that we were wrong. To say, "I don't know," is not an admission of defeat. It's the beginning of real learning. If you can embrace that mindset, you've already separated yourself from the crowd of the foolish and stepped onto the path of wisdom. Sign number 2, constant blaming. One of the clearest signs of a foolish person is their obsession with blame. Blame becomes their armor, their excuse, and ultimately their prison. These individuals never take ownership of their failures or setbacks. If something goes wrong, it's always someone else's fault. The boss, the market, the weather, society, even fate. But underneath this pattern lies something much deeper. Fear. The fear of being wrong. The fear of being seen as weak. The fear of facing the truth. Instead of confronting their shortcomings and using them as stepping stones for growth, they deflect, point fingers, and cast themselves as the victim of forces beyond their control. But what does this constant blaming truly achieve? Nothing. In fact, it strips a person of their power. When you blame others, you give away your ability to change, to improve, and to influence the outcome next time. It's a form of surrender, dressed up to look like strength. Blaming others might protect the ego in the short term, but it poisons long-term growth. The Stoics understood this well. Epictetus once said, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our opinions about them." The wise person looks inward. They know that even if they didn't cause a problem, they still have control over how they respond to it. That's real power. That's where wisdom begins. Let me tell you about someone I once worked with, Lisa, an event organizer responsible for planning a major conference. She had months to prepare, but when the big day arrived, attendance was dismal. Her first reaction, she blamed the marketing team. "They didn't promote it well enough," she said. "No one even knew it was happening." And to the surface, that seemed like a reasonable explanation. But when leadership looked deeper, it turned out Lisa had delayed sending critical event details, pushing the marketing campaign far behind schedule. Even after this came to light, she refused to accept responsibility. She doubled down, shifted the blame, and in doing so, lost the trust of her entire team. Eventually, she stepped down, not because she wasn't capable, but because her refusal to take ownership closed the door on any chance for redemption. Foolish people often fear that admitting fault will make them look weak, but the truth is exactly the opposite. Owning your mistakes is one of the most powerful things you can do. It builds trust. It shows character. It turns failure into fuel. The wise don't waste time pointing fingers. They point inward first. They ask, "What could I have done differently? Where did I fall short?" Not out of shame, but out of a genuine desire to improve. Stoic philosophy teaches us that we cannot control everything that happens to us, but we can always control our response. That's where responsibility comes in. It's not about taking the blame for things that aren't your fault. It's about recognizing where you do have influence and using that to grow. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it. And if it is your fault, do not hide from it." That level of honesty requires courage, but it also leads to clarity, freedom, and real self-respect. So the next time you're tempted to blame someone else for your situation, pause, breathe, ask yourself, am I running from the truth? Am I avoiding a lesson I need to learn? Because every moment of failure carries a hidden opportunity, a door to growth that only opens when you take full responsibility. And when you do, you not only become stronger, you also become someone others can rely on. Someone who learns quickly, adapts faster, and leads with integrity. If you found yourself in the habit of blaming others, whether at work, in relationships, or even with yourself, don't beat yourself up. Awareness is the first step. From there, you can begin to shift. Replace blame with reflection. Replace excuses with questions. Replace deflection with action. And remember, responsibility isn't a burden, it's a superpower. When you hold yourself accountable, you stop waiting for the world to change and start creating change from within. Blame keeps you stuck. Responsibility sets you free. The choice between the two defines the difference between foolishness and wisdom. Sign number 3. Arrogance over humility. Have you ever met someone who feels the need to constantly prove they're the smartest person in the room? They interrupt others mid-sentence, dismiss suggestions without thought, and seem more focused on being heard than actually understanding what's being said. This is the third clear sign of a foolish person: arrogance. Arrogance isn't strength, it's insecurity disguised as confidence. It's a mask people wear when they're terrified of being seen as imperfect. And while the foolish wrap themselves in arrogance to feel powerful, the wise know that true strength comes from humility. Arrogance shuts the door to growth. It convinces a person they already know enough, that they have nothing left to learn, and that listening is beneath them. But learning begins the moment we stop trying to impress others and start trying to understand them. A truly wise person isn't concerned with being right. They're focused on getting better. They listen more than they speak. They ask more questions than they answer. They're comfortable saying, "I don't know," because they recognize that not knowing is not a weakness. It's a starting point. That's the paradox. The more you think you know everything, the less room you have to grow. Let me share a real example. Years ago, I worked with a man named Michael, a senior manager in a large corporation. On the surface, Michael was brilliant, quick thinker, sharp dresser, confident speaker, but in every meeting he made it clear that he believed he was the smartest one there. He spoke over his colleagues, scoffed at their ideas, and shut down discussions that didn't align with his opinions. At first, people respected him, or at least pretended to, but over time that respect turned into resentment. His arrogance made the team feel small, unheard, and undervalued. Eventually, a major project failed, not because the team lacked talent, but because Michael had ignored everyone's input and forced through his own flawed vision. When his boss asked what went wrong, Michael didn't have a real answer. His ego had blinded him to the lessons he should have learned months before. That's what arrogance does. It isolates you. It prevents collaboration, poisons communication, and replaces wisdom with delusion. The Stoics warned against this trap. Seneca once wrote, "The first step towards learning is the recognition of one's ignorance." In other words, to grow wise, we must first admit what we don't know. It takes courage to be humble. It takes strength to step aside and let others shine. But the fool resists this. The fool needs constant validation. The wise, on the other hand, don't seek recognition, they seek truth. Humility isn't about thinking less of yourself. It's about thinking of yourself less. It's the quiet confidence that doesn't need to shout. It's the strength that shows up not in dominating others, but in lifting them up. When you operate with humility, you create space for new ideas, deeper connections, and better outcomes. People trust you more. They feel safe bringing you their thoughts. And because of that, you become more informed, more grounded, and ultimately more effective. So how can you tell if you're falling into the trap of arrogance? Ask yourself, am I listening with the intent to understand or just waiting for my turn to talk? Do I feel threatened when others are right? Am I more focused on looking smart than actually learning something new? These questions are mirrors, tools for reflection. And if you're brave enough to answer them honestly, you've already stepped onto the path of growth. If you've been arrogant in the past, don't despair. We all have moments when our egos take the wheel, but those moments don't define us. How we respond to them does. Start by practicing humility in the small things. Let others finish speaking. Admit when you don't know something. Thank people for their feedback even when it stings. These small acts create massive internal shifts. They open the door to real wisdom and build the kind of character that others respect, not out of fear, but out of genuine admiration. In a world where so many people are shouting to be heard, be the one who listens. In a culture obsessed with being right, be the one who chooses to learn. Because in the silence of humility, you'll find a deeper kind of power, the power that transforms not only how you lead others, but how you live your life. The wise don't rise by proving they're better than everyone else. They rise by helping others rise with them. And that's something no amount of arrogance can ever achieve. Sign number 4, lack of empathy. One of the most damaging traits of a foolish person is a lack of empathy. Empathy, the ability to truly understand and feel what someone else is going through, is not just a soft skill. It's a mark of emotional intelligence, moral maturity, and wisdom. When someone lacks empathy, they see the world only through their own narrow lens. They judge harshly, assume quickly, and rarely pause to consider the pain or challenges someone else might be facing. In their mind, everything is black and white. People either perform or they fail. There's no room for context, no space for compassion. But wisdom, real, stoic wisdom, teaches us that understanding the inner lives of others isn't weakness. It's strength, and the person who cannot empathize is not just ignorant of others, they are disconnected from their own humanity. A lack of empathy doesn't always come across as overt cruelty. Sometimes it's more subtle, a sarcastic comment, a dismissive tone, a refusal to ask how someone's really doing. But these small acts create deep wounds. When you can't feel for someone else, you end up causing harm without even realizing it. And over time, that harm creates walls that keep you isolated, misunderstood, and emotionally stunted. Foolish people think empathy slows them down or makes them vulnerable, but in reality, empathy is what connects us to others and elevates our understanding of the world. As Marcus Aurelius once said, whenever you are about to find fault with someone, ask yourself the following question: what fault of mine most nearly resembles the one I am about to criticize? Let me tell you a story. A few years ago, I worked on a project with a colleague named Paul. On paper, Paul was efficient and reliable, but there was one problem. He lacked empathy. He had no patience for delays, no tolerance for personal setbacks, and no real interest in anyone's struggles but his own. One time, a coworker named Susan missed an important deadline. Paul immediately lashed out, criticizing her publicly in a team meeting. He accused her of being unprofessional, lazy, and irresponsible. What he didn't know, or didn't care to ask, was that Susan's young son was seriously ill and she had been spending nights in the hospital trying to hold her life together. When the truth eventually came out, Paul didn't apologize. He just moved on, pretending like his words hadn't caused damage, but the damage was done. The team stopped trusting him. Susan became quieter, more withdrawn. The environment changed, all because one person refused to lead with compassion. Foolishness isn't just about ignorance. It's about the refusal to connect. It's about being so self-absorbed that you forget others are fighting battles you can't see. The Stoics understood this. They believed that every human being was part of the same universal community, bound by shared reason and shared struggle. To turn your back on someone else's suffering is to deny your own place in that human family. Epictetus taught that we are all actors in a play we didn't write, assigned roles we didn't choose. So before judging someone's performance, try to understand the script they were handed. Now, you might be wondering, how can I become more empathetic if I've struggled with it in the past? The first step is listening, and not just hearing words, but listening with the intent to understand. Put yourself in the other person's shoes, even if it's uncomfortable. Ask questions, be present, slow down enough to care. The second step is to resist the urge to assume. You don't know someone's full story from a single moment. You don't know what kind of pain they carry when they show up with a smile on their face. And finally, practice compassion toward yourself. Often, those who lack empathy are also hard on themselves. They see kindness as a transaction. But when you begin to treat yourself with understanding, it becomes easier to extend that same grace to others. If you've noticed yourself being cold, indifferent, or judgmental, don't beat yourself up. Awareness is the first step to change. You can choose empathy. You can choose to lead with kindness without becoming weak. Because empathy doesn't mean lowering your standards. It means raising your understanding. It means becoming someone who sees not just the outcome, but the whole human being behind it. In a world that often prizes results over relationships, being empathetic is a revolutionary act. It takes courage to slow down, to feel, to care. But that courage builds trust. It strengthens teams. It heals relationships. And most importantly, it makes you wise, not just in mind, but in spirit. So ask yourself, am I quick to judge or willing to understand? Am I reacting from habit or responding with heart? The foolish ignore what they don't feel. The wise allow themselves to feel deeply, and from that place, they rise. Sign number 5, fear of change. The fifth sign of a foolish person is the fear of change. At first glance, fear of change may seem harmless, just a desire to keep things familiar, predictable, and safe. But look closer, and you'll see how deeply it erodes progress. Fear of change is like trying to hold back the ocean with your hands. Life moves, circumstances shift, the world evolves, whether we're ready for it or not. And those who resist this flow cling to outdated habits, old beliefs, and broken systems. Not because they work, but because they're familiar. But here's the truth. Comfort zones don't keep you safe. They keep you small. Foolish people see change as a threat. They panic at the thought of trying something new, stepping into uncertainty, or leaving behind what once worked. They live in the past, replaying routines that no longer serve them because the unknown feels too risky. But the Stoics taught that the only constant in life is change. Marcus Aurelius wrote, Observe constantly that all things take place by change. This wasn't a warning, it was an invitation. Change isn't your enemy. It's the raw material of growth, transformation, and wisdom. Take the story of Michael. He was a man who had spent his entire life in a quiet neighborhood. Every morning he visited the same cafe, walked the same streets, talked to the same people. It gave him comfort. When his children encouraged him to move closer to them in a city filled with new opportunities, Michael refused. "I know everyone here," he said. "Why would I start over somewhere else?" He didn't want to leave his familiar routines. But over time, his neighborhood changed anyway. Stores closed, friends moved away. The community he clung to slowly faded. And eventually, Michael realized that by holding on to what was, he had missed what could have been. When he finally did move, he discovered a new life waiting, deeper connections with his family, a healthier lifestyle, and a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The life he feared turned out to be the life he needed. That's the irony. People think avoiding change protects them from loss, but in reality, it often causes it. You lose time, you lose growth, you lose chances to become who you were meant to be. The wise recognize this. They don't wait for change to become unavoidable. They walk into it willingly, knowing that discomfort is part of evolution. Stoic philosophy urges us to practice premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity, not to live in fear, but to prepare our minds for the reality that life will not stand still. It teaches us to meet uncertainty with grace and to see change not as an obstacle, but as a teacher. If you find yourself resisting change, ask, what am I really afraid of? Is it failure? Is it losing control? Is it having to admit that the old way no longer works? These fears are normal, but they are also illusions. Because staying the same is not the same as being safe. It's choosing slow decay over fast growth. It's accepting stagnation when you were born to evolve. Embracing change doesn't mean throwing away everything you've built. It means having the courage to ask, is this still serving me? It means updating your mindset like you would update a piece of software. Not because the old version was bad, but because something better is possible. And it means recognizing that the unknown is not a place of danger. It's a space of potential. Everything valuable in life, love, wisdom, success, self-discovery, requires a step into the unfamiliar. So how do you overcome the fear of change? Start small. Change one habit. Learn one new skill. Say yes to one uncomfortable opportunity. Let yourself fail and then rise. The more you practice change, the less power fear has over you. And in time, you'll begin to see that every change you feared was simply a doorway to a version of you that's stronger, wiser, and more aligned with your purpose. If you've been holding back, staying stuck, or playing it safe, this is your sign to move. The future isn't waiting, it's already unfolding. And the longer you resist, the more you miss. Don't let fear rob you of your growth. Let faith in your own resilience guide you forward. Because at the end of the day, change is not something to fear, it's something to master. And those who embrace it don't just survive, they evolve. Sign number 6, talking more than listening. The sixth sign of a foolish person is one of the easiest to spot but hardest to change. They talk far more than they listen. They dominate conversations, interrupt constantly, and dismiss the thoughts of others without a second thought. To them, every moment of silence is a missed opportunity to showcase their opinion. They confuse talking with wisdom, volume with value, and presence with dominance. But the truth is, when someone talks more than they listen, they reveal more about their insecurity than their intelligence. And in doing so, they shut the door on learning, growth, and connection. We've all encountered people like this, at work, in our families, in friendships. Their voice fills the room, but somehow no one feels heard. They share endless advice, tell long-winded stories, and always have the final word. But while they believe they're enlightening others, what they're really doing is building walls between themselves and the world. The Stoics believed that wisdom begins in silence. Epictetus famously said, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." The person who cannot listen is not leading, they're performing. And performance rarely brings clarity. Let me tell you about someone I once knew. His name was John, a father and husband who deeply loved his family but couldn't stop talking. Every dinner conversation turned into a monologue. His kids would start telling a story about school, and within seconds, he'd cut in with a lecture. His wife would share a concern about their finances, and John would immediately correct her or offer a solution without truly listening. At first, the family tolerated it, but over time they began to shut down. His children stopped sharing. His wife stopped trying to engage. He couldn't understand why everyone seemed so distant. After all, he was always talking. What he failed to realize was that he wasn't connecting. He was broadcasting, and the more he spoke, the more alone he became. This is the danger of excessive talking. It creates the illusion of connection while killing actual communication. When we talk without listening, we drown out the voices that could challenge us, teach us, or simply help us see from another perspective. We push people away not with anger or cruelty, but with our inability to pause. The foolish talk to be heard. The wise listen to understand. Listening is not passive, it's an active discipline. It requires humility, patience, and presence. It means being willing to put your thoughts on hold and give someone else the space to fully express themselves. It means resisting the urge to jump in with advice or opinions and instead asking, what is this person really trying to say? In many ways, listening is an act of service. It tells others, you matter. Your voice matters. And in return, it opens the door to mutual respect and authentic dialogue. Stoic philosophy teaches us that listening is a practice in virtue. It embodies self-control, wisdom, and compassion. When you listen deeply, you not only gain insights about others, you learn about yourself. You learn to recognize your own biases, your emotional triggers, your assumptions. You begin to hear not just what people say, but what they mean. And from this space of clarity, you make better decisions, build stronger relationships, and grow into a person others trust. So how can we tell if we're falling into the trap of talking too much? Ask yourself, do I often interrupt others before they finish speaking? Do I feel uncomfortable with silence? Do I talk just to fill space or prove a point? Do people often seem disengaged when I speak? These questions are uncomfortable, but they're essential, because if we're honest, we've all had moments where we spoke too much and listened too little. The difference lies in what we do next. If you see yourself in John's story, don't panic. Change is possible. It starts with awareness and small intentional actions. The next time someone talks to you, pause, make eye contact. Don't just wait for your turn to respond. Actually absorb their words, ask follow-up questions, clarify their meaning. And when you feel the urge to interrupt, stop, breathe, let them finish. You'll be amazed at how much more you understand when you let silence speak. There's a reason the wisest people in the room are often the quietest. They're not disengaged, they're observing, they're reflecting. They're giving space for truth to emerge. Because wisdom isn't about saying the most. It's about knowing when to speak and when to stay still. Talking without listening is like planting seeds in concrete. Nothing grows. But when you listen with intention, you cultivate understanding, connection, and respect. You show others that they matter. And in return, you become someone worth listening to. So if you truly want to grow in wisdom, start by closing your mouth and opening your ears. Because the fool talks to be heard, but the wise, they listen to become better. Sign number 7, living for validation. The 7th sign of a foolish person is subtle, but deeply damaging. Living for validation. These are the people who measure their worth based on how others see them. Their decisions, values, and even identities are shaped by the need to be liked, admired, or praised. They chase compliments like currency, depend on approval like oxygen, and fear rejection as if it were death. On the surface, they may appear confident, posting selfies with perfect captions, highlighting their every achievement, or name-dropping accomplishments in conversation. But behind that image is a fragile self, one that relies entirely on the world to reflect back a sense of worth. The wise know that seeking validation is a bottomless pit, but the foolish keep digging anyway, hoping that maybe, just maybe, if they earn enough likes or praise, they'll finally feel whole. But they never do. Because external validation by nature is fleeting. It can disappear with one negative comment, one moment of failure, one silence from the crowd. And when it does, the person who has built their identity on approval crumbles. This is why Stoic philosophy warns us not to tie our happiness to the opinions of others. Epictetus put it plainly, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." In other words, if you want to live freely, you must stop living for applause. Living for validation is exhausting. It keeps you constantly performing, always adjusting who you are depending on who you're around. You act one way at work, another way with friends, and another on social media. All because you're trying to fit what others expect rather than standing in your truth. But wisdom requires integrity. It asks you to be the same person in public and in private, to speak your truth even when it's unpopular, to do what's right even when no one notices. The person who lives for validation will never know peace because they've handed their self-worth over to the opinions of others, opinions that shift like the wind. Let me share a story. A young man named David spent years trying to prove his success to others. He bought expensive clothes, drove a luxury car he couldn't afford, and took job offers not because they fulfilled him, but because they impressed others. On the outside, he looked like he had it all together, but on the inside, he felt empty. One day, after getting laid off from a high-paying position, he fell into a deep depression, not because he had lost a job, but because he had lost his identity. His entire sense of self had been tied to the title on his business card and the perception others had of him. It took time, therapy, and introspection for David to realize he had been living someone else's dream. And when he finally let go of needing to be admired, he started building a life that actually meant something to him. Not just something that looked good from the outside. That's the danger of validation seeking. It can look like success while quietly robbing you of your purpose. It leads people to chase careers they don't love, relationships they don't belong in, and lifestyles they can't sustain. All for what? A fleeting nod of approval. But the Stoics urge us to seek something deeper, self-approval, the kind of inner confidence that comes from living by your own values, regardless of whether the world claps for you. So how can you tell if you're trapped in the cycle of validation? Ask yourself, do I often do things just to be liked? Do I change my opinions depending on who's around? Do I feel anxious when others don't acknowledge my efforts? If the answer is yes, don't panic. The goal isn't to shame yourself, it's to wake up. You are allowed to want connection, to enjoy compliments, to feel good when someone sees your worth. But that feeling should be a bonus, not a necessity. It should add to your identity, not create it. Begin by practicing solitude, not loneliness, but intentional time alone with your thoughts. Learn to enjoy your own company. Learn to affirm yourself. When you make a decision, ask, is this aligned with my values, or am I just trying to look good? Replace performance with authenticity. Replace chasing praise with pursuing purpose. Replace the question, do they like me, with, am I proud of myself? You will find that the more you honor your truth, the less you need others to validate it. And ironically, that's when people start to respect you more, when you no longer beg for it. The most powerful people aren't those with the loudest applause. They're the ones who can stand in silence and still feel whole. So if you've been living for the approval of others, this is your invitation to stop performing and start living, because the wise don't chase recognition. They live with intention. They do what's right, even if no one notices. And that kind of life, that's where real fulfillment begins. Sign number 8, refusing to learn from mistakes. The 8th and final sign of a foolish person is perhaps the most dangerous of all, the refusal to learn from mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes, it's part of being human. But what separates the wise from the foolish is not the number of times they fall, but what they choose to do after they fall. The foolish ignore their failures, deny responsibility, and repeat the same errors over and over again, each time expecting a different result. They treat setbacks as injustices rather than invitations to grow. They become trapped in loops of their own making, blind to the lessons life is trying to teach them. There is no shame in being wrong. The Stoics never claimed perfection. In fact, they believed that every mistake, if examined with honesty, was an opportunity for virtue, for refinement, for growth. Epictetus said, "Every error is a chance to learn, if only you do not run from it. But the foolish do run. They blame, distract, deny, or pretend that nothing happened. They fear the discomfort of introspection more than they fear failure itself, and in doing so they remain stuck, not because they lack ability, but because they lack humility." Let's consider a real-world example. I once worked with a man named Ryan. He was brilliant on paper, full of energy and ideas. But whenever something went wrong, a missed deadline, a failed pitch, a broken team dynamic, he would point fingers or act as if it never happened. He would say things like, "It's just bad luck," or "They didn't understand my vision." He never stopped to ask, "What could I have done differently?" As a result, the same problems kept following him from project to project, job to job. Eventually, opportunities dried up, and people stopped trusting him. not because he failed, but because he refused to grow. This is what happens when someone is unwilling to learn from failure. They don't just stay where they are, they move backward, because life keeps moving forward, and if you're not evolving with it, you're being left behind. The Stoics believed in daily reflection. Marcus Aurelius would ask himself each night, what did I do well today? What did I fail at? And how can I be better tomorrow? This wasn't self-criticism, it was self-awareness. And through that awareness, he became stronger, wiser, and more grounded. You don't need to be perfect to live well, you just need to be honest. When we refuse to learn from our mistakes, we shut the door on self-mastery. We protect the ego at the expense of our future. But when we choose to face our failures with open eyes and a humble heart, everything changes. Failure becomes feedback, pain becomes a teacher, and every misstep becomes a stepping stone. So how do we begin to learn from our mistakes? First, we must practice radical honesty. That means admitting when we've fallen short, not just to others, but to ourselves. It means saying, I made a mistake, without defensiveness, without excuses. Second, we must sit with the discomfort. Most people run from the shame of failure, but if you can stay with it, really sit in it, you'll start to see patterns, choices, and turning points you hadn't noticed before. And third, we must act. Wisdom doesn't come from thinking about change, it comes from doing it. Adjust your strategy. Apologize if needed. Try again with a new approach. Let your past mistakes guide your future behavior, not define your identity. If you've spent years repeating the same habits, making the same mistakes, and wondering why nothing ever changes, don't lose hope. The moment you decide to learn, your past no longer holds you captive. It becomes your foundation, it becomes your classroom. And from that place you can rise higher than ever before. Refusing to learn from mistakes isn't just foolish, it's a form of self-sabotage. It says, I care more about protecting my pride than building my potential. But the wise choose differently. They are willing to feel uncomfortable, to admit wrong, to grow in public. They understand that every great transformation begins with a moment of humility. So ask yourself, am I repeating patterns that no longer serve me? Am I afraid of being wrong, or am I committed to becoming better? The answer to those questions will shape the trajectory of your life. Because wisdom isn't just about what you know, it's about what you're willing to learn, even when it hurts. The Stoic path is not about perfection, it's about persistence. It's about waking up every day with the courage to say, yesterday I fell short, but today I will do better. That's how wisdom is built. Not in a single moment of enlightenment, but in 1,000 small choices to learn, grow, and evolve. So don't let your past be your prison. Let it be your proving ground. Choose to learn. Choose to rise. And in doing so, choose wisdom over foolishness, again and again. We've now walked through the 8 signs of a stupid person, not to judge, but to awaken. If even one of these signs hit close to home, that's not failure. That's awareness. And awareness is the beginning of wisdom. The truth is we all stumble, but the wise rise, again and again, not because they're perfect, but because they're willing to grow. If this video spoke to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Deep Dive Stoic. Your journey doesn't end here. Watch one of the suggested videos on the screen to keep learning and growing with us. Thank you for being a part of our channel, and more importantly, a part of this movement toward deeper living. Stay strong, stay thoughtful, and stay stoic.